Yeah, hello everyone again. Thanks for sticking around. There were a few questions in my session beforehand around how we actually do this reporting piece, the metrics and targets and pillars and everything that's around it. And that's what we want to talk about in this session. We want to walk you through what's essentially required to get started with carbon reporting. As bleak as my session was, that was the feedback I've received. Metrics and measuring what's going on currently and measuring, having a really robust way of measuring the success going forward and pathways to decarbonization are the starting point. And that's why we have to dial it back to the bare numbers to essentially get started. So we are now at metrics and targets. We've covered the other pillars beforehand. And I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of what's required and what needs to be covered. And then Ben's going to walk you through how it's actually done and essentially the take that we are offering here at Fair Supply. Thanks, Kate. Thanks for the heads up. Yeah, so I've obviously talked about climate change and the mechanics of what's happening in the atmosphere and stuff for a while, and mainly in my academic career. And often, like, I've had sessions where people literally left the room crying. So I'm glad I didn't get to that point in this session. One more comment I wanted to make on the previous session is that people asked me how I stay positive amongst all of this. And what I didn't say, what I wanted to say is that the comparison I often use is that the first powered flight was in 1903, and 66 years later, the Americans landed on the moon. So no one would have been able to predict that kind of technological advancement in 1903. And so we are making, in 2025, we are making predictions here up to 2100. So our understanding is developing still. And I think what we're going to see in the next 50 years, 80 years will probably be different from what our understanding is at the moment. So that's why I still am hopeful that not everything is lost. So it's not just all that I think, oh, it's all doom and gloom, and so we're just going to make the best of what we have now. So there's a lot we can still do, a lot we should do, and what we're doing here is part of this essentially. But let's get into this session. So something in my room just fell over, but I don't know what it was. So the expected disclosures that we have is there's a metrics component and there's a targets component. So the metrics is what we need to measure. Often, like I mentioned in my previous session, often the manual component of getting to the metrics is already so like labor intensive and so complicated that we often don't have much time left for the targets. So that's why we need to automate as much as we can on the metrics side so we can focus on the targets, because that's what's actually going on. So I'm not going to go through these point by point. You can read them yourself later on or now. But it's essentially, it's a dance between metrics and targets. What can we measure? Where do we want to get to? How do we measure where we want to get to? So it's a back and forth between metrics and targets. So if we focus on the metrics, we dial it back to what we already discussed earlier, which is how do we measure greenhouse gas emissions? We use the greenhouse gas protocols approach. At least that gives us a unified way of how we talk about our emissions, how we measure our successes, how we measure what's currently going on. I only talked about the actual, you could say the basic part of the emissions in my previous session. There's a few spin-offs, for example, emissions of franchises and financed emissions that need a lot more thinking around it. But most of what's going on in financed emissions and franchise emissions falls back onto the basic principles that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol defines. So essentially, once you've taken a start into measuring, it gets easier and easier. And there's a lot of support that can be offered from an automation perspective, which is Ben's specialty, what he's going to talk about. So there's risks involved that we need to understand. So once we've managed to measure everything in terms of emissions that we want to, that we have to measure, and that is relevant to our business, there's also other stuff we need to report on, and those are the actual risks. And for me, I always translate risks in terms of a risk is essentially a possibility that I might lose money. So I need to understand what are the risks of all of this going on. And the bullet points seem quite static in my view, and they are not, and that's often a bit confusing. So when I read out the amount and percentage of assets or business activities vulnerable to climate-related transition risks, so if I transition towards the climate, how does that put my assets under risk? That's essentially a moving target, because the earlier I start, the easier the transition actually is. And I have to think about, like, how long do I wait before the risk becomes so big that the transitions actually affect a lot more of my business than what it would if I started earlier. The second one is, I think, is a bit easier to grasp. That's the physical risks. That's, for example, you have a factory that is next to a waterway which is subject to flooding. That's the physical risk to an asset of your business. And again, the physical risk, you saw the likelihoods of climate impacts in my previous slide deck. Those physical risks, they are also a moving target. The longer we wait, the bigger and greater these physical risks get. So climate change is essentially set to become quite a lot more expensive. And of course, we want to protect any business against financial losses. And this is actually working hand in hand, saving the planet and the future of our children and the viability of our businesses. In this case, actually goes hand in hand. Whereas often, sort of in, you could say, popular discussions, it often is portrayed as working against one another. And it's often like, we can't afford to go green. And the question is, no, when will you realize that there's a point in time where it flips, where you cannot afford not to go green anymore? So, yeah, so these disclosures then again, they go hand in hand, and the two boxes here summarize essentially what metrics and targets are required to be disclosed. And this is also for the first time now we're moving into a time where there is how climate-related factors are incorporated into executive remuneration, which is an interesting point, because this is now becoming a board problem, an executive problem. It's not just something, we have to look after the climate, and so we've got someone assigned to meeting our reporting guidelines. So this is now moved, this is being mainstreamed now. So and I think it's only going to work if it actually not just arrives on our to-do list, but actually arrives in our understanding of how we want to run businesses. So that's sort of setting the scene. So there's a lot of measurement that needs to be done. There's a lot of understanding of our own carbon and exposure profile for actual emissions, but also for risk that is required. But everything starts with proper emissions calculations, measurement and reporting. I'm going to hand over to Ben to walk you through what this looks like.
Thanks, Anna, and hi everyone. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Chief Product and Technology Officer at Fair Supply. So I think a lot of what I'm about to walk you through, I would say, is me standing on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. So a lot of the product that we've been building, really leverages all of Arnaud's work. And I've also had the pleasure of working very closely with Amanda Irwin on some of these pieces as well over the last couple of years, who I know is you will have met as part of this the sessions. So what I'm going to talk you through and show you is the Fair Supply product. And I know there's a few customers of Fair Supply on the call. However, what I'm not trying to do is pitch you on Fair Supply. What I want to do is actually walk through quite practically what is the process for getting through a, excuse me, just choose the right demo account. What is the process of getting to, I guess, a starting point? Because I've sort of been kind of listening to a lot of the questions and hearing some of the concerns about, like, how do we get started? How do we get the buy-in? Like, what are the pieces that we need to like start thinking about? So I know that that's something I want to touch on probably in a bit of detail in terms of, like, what do you need to start thinking about, as well as how do you actually start moving towards not only scope 1 and 2, but also scope 3 and understanding the data, because it is a very complex and technical area. So I guess just jumping into it, I think this is showing Fair Supply's platform, and I'm going to talk more to the concepts than to the product features themselves. But you can see here, if I'm thinking about emissions, what's important is, like, I think starting to track the data early and often, and I think that's probably come up a bit in the sessions already today. But starting to think about, even from a quarterly perspective, like, what are you measuring? What are the gaps? How is the company performing? As a starting point, because I think that really helps understand where the gaps are and what you need to get to a comprehensive report when the time comes. And so what this is showing here, just very briefly, is just an overview over time of the kilotons of CO2e. This is I should probably just say this is a version of a demo account. We have given everyone, and you should have received access to one of these accounts over the last 24 hours with a set of practice data in it. The expectation is not that we you need to be like hands-on with that in this session. We're going to walk through and like explain a lot of the core concepts, but certainly we wanted to make that available to you so you could actually play around with and put into practice what we talked through today. I just want to acknowledge your comment, Belinda, about the log on page. I won't be able to do that and sort that out while I'm screen sharing, but I will have a look at it immediately after this, I promise. And if anyone else is having any issues, please do let me know. So jumping into the good stuff, I think as you're probably aware, there's scope 1 and 2, and then the scope 3, and we kind of approach each one a little bit differently because of the nature of the reporting. And so what I want to do is just take you through the key components and concepts of putting together a scope 1 and 2 report. Now, in the accounts, when you log in, there are some examples already in there that I've created that give you a good understanding of what sort of data needs to go in, and then what that looks like coming out the end in terms of the compliance ready report. But you're also welcome to start playing around and creating your own. You have full access to those accounts to kind of really start to understand the data a little bit more. And I think what we heard from customers that I want to kind of I guess double down on here is like that getting started piece is really, really difficult. And so what we put the focus on for scope 1 and 2 reporting, and I'll actually just use this example here, is being able to get from the start to finish of an estimate to start with as quickly as possible with as little data on hand as you need. Because I think the data gathering process, as I think a few people have called out in the comments, is like there is work to be done there if the business is not already set up to do that. But it's also hard to know where to start if you don't actually understand what are the different types of data that we as a business should be collecting and collating ongoing. And so going through the process of creating an initial estimate really does help not only get to a baseline or a rough benchmark, but it also enables you to understand a little bit more about what are those different types of data, and like, do we have the data collection processes in place now? And if not, we need to get them set up so that we can be automating that collection and pulling it in. So going through here, so scope 1 is really about that consumption of fuels in the process of the business's operations. And so we've broken it up into a number of sections, which hopefully helps kind of maybe demystify. I feel like this is probably going to be a little bit like unimpressive in terms of like we've got walking through, but that's by its very nature. We've tried to simplify it down as much as possible at this first pass. And so if you go through, the things that you need to start thinking about are things like vehicle fleet, stationary gases, stationary equipment, 2 stationaries that we can talk through in a second, medicinal gases, industrial processes, and that's all the scope 1 components. And then purchased electricity being the core component of scope 2 for most organizations for now. And what we've done is we've created this ability to create a basic and a comprehensive estimate. And you can go through and play around with this and see how it all works. But at the highest level, for example, for vehicle fleet, rather than not being able to get started until you have all of the outputs and the numbers from your vehicle fleet. Sorry, I'm just seeing the comments. Make it a bit bigger. I can try. Yes. So if we get in here, and if folks are having a little bit of trouble with their own demo accounts, let me know, and we can chat about that after the session, and we can work out and make sure that you've got the right accesses and things like that. If you can see here, what we've done here is we've created a set of standard vehicle types based off Bureau of Statistics and other data. And what we've also done is included average fuel consumption for those vehicles over the course of a year. Now, this is obviously a very rough measure, and it's not a compliant ready output, but it does give you a really good starting point for something that's like can quite often be one of those more complicated and like blocking things for a company to get started on in terms of collecting that data. So we've got things like passenger vehicles, motorcycles, light commercial vehicles. And so most, we've based this on those averages. And so most organizations with at least a high level understanding of what their vehicle fleet looks like can get to a basic estimation for the annual fuel consumption of their vehicle fleet just based off this data. And it's not just kind of guesstimates, it is like based off that statistical data. Obviously that varies quite significantly from business to business, but that starts to give you, and I will zoom out again here for a second, that starts to give you along this right-hand side, starts to build out a view of your scope 1 and as you go. So this is something that that's already been filled out as part of the demo, but if I adjust this, you can kind of see that, if I add more passenger vehicles to the fleet, it does change the number. And if I add, 012 is not going to help. If I add diesel passenger vehicles or perhaps a few buses, depending on my business, you can start to see how that impacts your scope 1 and your total scope 1 and scope 2. And that's a calculation that's happening in the background based off the combination of that vehicle-based data that I mentioned before, but also looking at and rolling in emissions factors data and that standardized way of reporting on emissions. So that's like obviously a great way to get started, and you can actually go through most of these sections, pretty quickly and get to a comprehensive estimate based on very little data. And so for a lot of customers, that's a really good starting point because it gets them off at a benchmark. It means that they now have a view of like, what are those different pieces of data that I need to go and be collecting if I want to come up with a comprehensive assessment that's ready to roll from a reporting standpoint. And then what they can do is come back and, whether you're doing this in Fair Supply or in a spreadsheet or whatever, the idea would then be you can come back, and what you do need from a reporting standpoint is a much more specific calculation. And so that's where we give the ability here. You can start with the basic, but then you can switch into what we call comprehensive, which gives you the ability to add in the metrics and the data that meets the reporting standards in terms of specificity. So you can see here, there's a couple of different options. You can calculate by the distance traveled by a vehicle or the refueling instances, and that kind of changes the things that you need, the data points that you need to capture. And so this gives businesses the opportunity, like often their organization will be tracking some of this stuff, but not always the same things. And so you could look at if your fleet management tracks distance traveled per car, you can just use that. If it tracks it by refueling instances, you can use that. Or if you have done all of the work, or at some point you do have all of the work done, you can come back in and you can actually just input the exact amounts, and that gets you to, I guess, the most detailed, most specific output possible. So there's a number of different ways you can cut it, but that's a great example of how you can get to a compliance ready estimate in a couple of different ways. So for example, if I look at this, I can go, okay, well, I've got a petrol ute. We've got that one's petrol, so we can say on average, our vehicles travel 100,000 kilometers. The fuel efficiency, if I remember correctly, is about 12 liters per 100 kilometers, and we've got a dozen of them. And you can go through and you can add in your exact vehicle fleet, and then that can be that is then calculated in the background based off that data. You can also then switch it around, change it to refueling instances or actual liters consumed. And so this is one of the more, I guess, complicated ones. It's probably the most obvious in terms of the types of data that you need to be grabbing in, but often like tracking and storing a vehicle fleet can be a little bit of an effort, given that those are often managed either externally or by other folks in the business. So, but hopefully everyone can understand, having gone through that piece, then it becomes really clear, like, what are the types of data that I need to be gathering? What do I need to be going and engaging with operations on in terms of starting to collect that data and see if we already have it available, and then if possible starting to enter that data in. So going through, we then have stationary gases, and we've kind of broken this down into the key elements for businesses. So you've then got piped natural gas and on-site ethane, and there's no basic or comprehensive option for this one because you either have it or you don't. And so usually organizations, if they are using piped natural gas, for example, will have that through either their bills or through their own tracking. Same goes for on-site ethane. That's tracked in cylinders. And so you can see here, what we've tried to do is take all the guesswork out of it. These are the most common units of measurement and how these fuels are either counted or operated with by organizations. So there's no kind of guessing around of like, oh, is this one, this particular unit of measurement? We've tried to kind of just take all that out. But if you're running this in a spreadsheet, you just have to have that consistent and measurable way of tracking that consumption. So it does differ per unit, and if it's not relevant to your business, you can also just say, okay, we don't actually have that as part of our business. Going through the rest quickly, there's stationary equipment, which is again, we've taken the approach of looking at some of the most common types of equipment that can be used by a business, but it's not a comprehensive or all-inclusive list. And just for a lot of companies, again, it's enough to get started. If you have an organization that has a forklift fleet or running generators, or have like these kind of the most common types of machinery, we've done the work under the hood to capture the average consumption, as well as pull in the emissions factors and the data needed to come up with those calculations. And again, if you put in what you think is the case, that's a good starting point, and you can see what it makes up as part of the total over here. But you can also come back in at any point and be like, oh, yeah, actually, I forgot we have 4 bulldozers, for example. It follows a very similar mechanic, which is then you can go in and you can actually calculate to the consistent and specific quantities. So here, the really key things to think about for equipment, it's a little bit different to vehicles. You can look at the amount of time that a particular piece of equipment was running on, generally speaking, for the year. Or you could look at refueling instances, again, if it's the type of vehicle that is tracked, or type of equipment, I should say. And again, like, you can use exact data, and there's lots of fun complexities around equipment used on site and things like that Louise may have gone into as part of her overview that I won't go into now. But definitely this is one, again, the reason why we've kind of included a basic and comprehensive is this is one of those areas that can be quite difficult if you're starting from zero to start calculating and getting to an initial estimate, which for a lot of companies really should be the goal, so they can start thinking about this stuff as quickly as possible. I'll pause there for a second. Arnaud, did you have anything to add to any of that, or any questions from the group?
I don't have anything to add. I mean, it's like each individual step of collecting these pieces of information is obviously quite simple. Getting it all organized is often what can be quite time consuming. So I think having a dashboard that allows for, essentially allow for trickle information flow to come in, which then sorts it in terms of like the entity that is being assessed, whether it's like vehicles or it's stationary gases, but also keeps a timestamp on it, is like removes a lot of the headaches at this point, which I think frees us up for looking at more important things, like looking at our transition plans.
Yeah, I think like it is one of those ones where the sooner you start tracking and you know what the things are that you need to track, I mean, I think it applies more broadly outside of this kind of area, but the better. So I think abstracting it from the fair supply product for a second, I think key takeaways here for me would be, start thinking about like what you need to be tracking early. What kind of metrics or quantities and things like that do you need to be registering so it's consistent and you have that data when you need it? If possible, have a system where you're starting to do those estimates and calculations early and often, so that when you get to the actual reporting period, the data's there. You've done a lot of the work. And I think the last thing is that there's lots of different layers that need to go into those calculations, like emissions factors and things like that. So starting to get together either by using a tool, which obviously being a product person would be my recommendation, but likewise, there are other options out there to do, manually or otherwise, like starting to put together the thinking around the methodology. So we've got a methodology under the hood here that helps with those calculations, and I'll get to the reporting piece in a sec. I think regardless of what you do, it's important to have that framework that you're going to use so that it's consistent, it's clear, and it meets the expectations of the regulations. I can see a question from Sandra. So can a tool external to this website be supplied for these calculations, example, Excel? Yeah, so that's I mean that's a really good question. I think for our product, that's been, I think we launched this towards the middle of last year, or towards the latter half of last year. I think that has been one of the key things that folks have been asking for, which we will be working on, which is the ability to kind of upload that data like an Excel or a CSV would be the easiest way to do so. I think the focus to start with has really been like for a lot of companies, given where they're at, just getting to that initial estimate, and in many cases it is at this point a manual entry, but certainly when it gets to the reporting, being able to upload that data, yeah, that is something that we will support. And Belinda, yes, we're going to get to supply chain examples just after this. So yeah, that's obviously like a key component of the reporting. Maybe not as pressing right now as scope 1 and 2, but certainly more complicated when it comes to like how do you measure and track. So I'll keep going. The rest is very, very similar. So with medicinal gases, this is as we go through, it gets much more, I guess, business specific. So a lot of organizations wouldn't necessarily use a lot of these in the day-to-day production or of their products or services. So here in this example, I've had it marked as non-existent. We've broken it down again to some of those common components like refrigerant leakage, carbon, ceramic carbonates, general carbonates, soda ash. These are all very common and very, well, they're common for certain types of businesses. You know, if you are that type of business that needs to, that does utilize or has to be reporting on these, then it's critical that they're included in the report. I think getting to the scope 2 piece, it is much more straightforward. In the sense that, you know, at this point in time, you know, the focus is really just around the reporting on the kilowatt hours to the particular grid. I think the slight nuance there is that all the different grids in Australia, including the 2 in Western Australia, do have different factors from a calculation perspective. So what we've got here is you can see the couple of WA ones. So there's the Northwestern interconnected system, and there's the Southwest. Then you've got all the main, the other main states, so New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, etc. And so this is like probably more of a relatively straightforward one for businesses, given that it is purchased electricity. They usually have a good record of the transactions and the usage related to that. So getting through to the final piece, I think I want to touch on the reporting of this stuff before we move on to scope 3. But you know, in terms of what you're seeing here, you can get to, as I said, like a basic estimate pretty quickly. You can then go back through and iteratively improve that estimate until you get to a compliance ready level of data, and this system will actually tell you when you've reached that point. But I think understanding, if you're not using a tool that kind of helps you, guides you to that, like understanding like what does meet the requirements from both a methodology and a compliance perspective is pretty important. So then just jumping to the reports section. So this is where I think Arno was talking about like having this kind of essentially immutable record of that data, the methodology that you use to create it, and then the key data that you need to report on is really important. So here what you can see is that same estimate translated and stored away as a report. And what that does is it kind of simplifies it all down into the key pieces of information that are needed from a reporting and a compliance perspective, particularly from an audit trail perspective, because you need to be able to, you know, go back. A lot of companies, as part of their reporting, reference the previous years and methodologies, and when they're talking about progress and particularly when you're talking about targets. And so as you can see here, we've broken it down. You've got your summary, which includes all your scope 1 and 2 emissions that have come out of that estimate. You've got some insights to add context to the data, and then you've got really the 2 key pieces, which is the high level scope 1 and the scope 2, the proportion of the total and the total kilotons of CO2 emissions. And so from a reporting and compliance perspective, those are the 2 big numbers that you want to be paying attention to. It also calls out that, you know, part of scope 1 has been calculated using that basic option, which isn't compliance ready, and so it gives you the opportunity to go back and work to improve that. There's a deeper dive down into scope 1, largely just covers off what I just walked through in terms of the calculator. Similarly with scope 2, I think probably the key thing to just call out here is the methodology. So again, whether you're using Fair Supply or a Excel or another tool, having a clear and detailed methodology that's consistent and meets the standards of the reporting criteria. It's well documented. You also have the original data source that was used, as well as the way to essentially rebuild those calculations using the methodology if needed. Oops, sorry. Which is really important. So with this report, you can see the source references that have been used to input the data and the emissions factors. You can see the summary of the data. It's essentially frozen in time, and you can it's linked back to the original source data as well. So this would give you everything you need from a compliance perspective, and you can understand once you've been through that a couple of times, and especially if I think it was Sandra said about the CSV, if you get to the point where you have all that data being tracked and you're able to then upload, a quarter's worth or a year's worth, very, very quick and easy to get to a compliance ready estimate, I guess, with the right tools and the right system in place. And in the case of Fair Supplies, where we also have the ability, because of the methodology, that is assured, which is, I guess, something that you would often pay a consultant, for that level of assurance on the data. And so, by having that methodology, the focus on the methodology under the hood here, we're able to do the same thing, but in a much more self-service and product-based way. So I'm conscious of time. So what I might do, while I'm jumping over, I'm happy to take any questions if people have them, but okay. Sorry, so I'm seeing Fiona's context there. So the question about Excel may have been, are there free ways of doing these calculations that don't rely on Fair Supply? I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, I don't know about the free piece in terms of compliance, but there's lots of different ways that could be used to calculate these. Arno, do you want to talk a little bit about, I guess, what goes into that if someone was, say, trying to do it just in Excel?
Yeah, I mean, especially for larger companies, it's a bit of a sort of death by spreadsheet exercise. When you look at the methodology page that Ben has open here now, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Australian legislation is quite prescriptive how to do this. So of course, it's very much possible to do this manually and go through the different references, pull out the different numbers, and do it essentially in Excel by hand. But even trained carbon consultants that do this on an Excel basis almost every day, even they need months to pull it together. So I guess if somebody was to start from scratch, it could be quite an effort to complete this task. And another thing is, if you're working for a larger company, it has a lot of items that need to be considered, either a large vehicle fleet or for the entire scope 1-2 assessment, just a lot of activity that needs to be considered. It's also a question of how this amount of data can be efficiently handled in Excel. And we haven't even talked about the scope 3 components. So imagine you have, say, 25, 30,000 suppliers that you're dealing with. Doing that manually is, of course, possible, but it would require a significant amount of almost busy work to pull the numbers together. So I think the sweet spot is what's the requirement internally and how many resources are available to do this manually.
And I apologize, I just also brought my attention to the Q&A as well. I was paying more attention to the chat. So there's a couple of questions, one from Kylie and one from Jennifer. So the first one is, how do you handle things where in traditional manual data collection for consultants, we can include assumptions or comments for consideration? For example, energy invoices don't align neatly, or do you just prorate outside of data entry into the system? Yeah, so I think that makes sense. I would say from my perspective, the ability to kind of customize the reports to more specific scenarios like that is definitely one that's come up. I think ultimately what's being produced here is, reflective of the inputs that are put in. So in that scenario, then perhaps, yes, if you want it to be as exacting as that, and the two options are to do that kind of, I guess, breakdown or work those assumptions into the data before you put it into the system and then just declare it when you're submitting the report. Or the second thing is, the reports, this report can be used for compliance, but most often, companies are just rolling this data and the methodology and stuff into their own more fulsome reports. And so there's an opportunity there to, I guess, declare more of the assumption. I think one of the ones I've most commonly heard from companies is like, where can I put in, allowance for the fact that my company is on the green energy scheme or using, I guess, a better performer in that regard. And I guess the short answer is that as far as the regulations go from a data perspective, like that's not how the methodology works. It's based off those average emissions factors for the grids. But certainly there's a desire for companies to declare more of those, because obviously if you're putting in the work and declaring, or like putting in the work, spending the money and also doing better than your average, then you want to be able to kind of show that in the final report. Arno, do you have anything to add on top of that?
No, I think I've said my bit. I think it was very.
And Jennifer had a question on the cars. Would a Ranger Ute type vehicle be lightly commercial or passenger? Is there a definition? There would be a definition in the background. I'm not sure my knowledge of cars is substantial enough to specifically answer that. I think probably the shorter answer is that for compliance, like, if what you're looking for is an estimate, it doesn't matter as much, in the sense that, what you're looking for there at that point is the broad strokes. But when it came to compliance, you would want and, need to have the more of those comprehensive specifics about each vehicle anyway. So that'd just be about kind of gathering that data. But we do have that data. If you're specifically interested in that, I'm quite interested. I can go and dig into the data we use to produce that, and I can do a comparison offline. I think basically for a basic estimate, you're looking for best fit, not necessarily exact. But again, that's more about building the kind of initial estimate rather than the compliant final report. So that's awesome. Thank you for the questions. I will jump over now to the supply chain stuff. So obviously Scope 3 isn't as much of a priority for this year in terms of the actual reporting. But it is on everyone's minds, I know, because it is probably one of the more difficult pieces when it comes to how do you actually track and how do you look down the supply chain. And so what I'm going to walk you through just quickly now is our live assessment. And the reason why we call it live assessment is because you can slice and dice the data, once you've got it into the system in kind of any way you want. So you can see I just actually switched from doing a modern slavery assessment to emissions. There's various factors here like data type, the actual data. So for example, I'm now looking at a data set that we put in for the demo that is specifically the fabricated metals sector. Likewise, I could look at if you're an organization, I could look at my construction department and I could actually break down and look at the supply chains of those individual areas of the business, because that can actually tell you a lot more about the business than just a really high level view. But for the purposes of the report, what this assessment does is it looks all the way down the supply chain using the methodologies and everything that Arno and the team have produced underneath. And it then takes that data that's produced around the individual companies in your supplier group or in the data set, looks down their supply chain and then breaks down the results in a couple of different ways. And I'll walk through that in a second, and then we'll go through like how that turns into a report from a screening perspective. So you can see here a couple of key pieces of data. So if I look at this data set, we look at your exposure to emissions in your supply chain. So you can get a very, very high level view of like how many companies are in a high exposure sector, moderate, high, moderate, etc. And just as I guess as a starting point, gives you a better understanding of the profile of your supply chain, and whether or not you have a lot of companies that you need to really be looking at, or a few. In this case, it's a few. And we're going to talk about due diligence in a little bit as well. So I'll talk about how we can kind of like assess that proactively rather than retrospectively. The question from Orly is, does the supplier have to use Fair Supply for you to have that data available? The short answer is no. We do have the opportunity to gather a lot more data from them to fine tune the results. But at a basic level, what all that is required in this example is the supplier name and the amount of expenditure on those. And then using Arno's methodologies, we then get to that assessment of them and their supply chain, based off essentially that. So you can do this without having to engage with individually each of your suppliers, but there is a role and a purpose for doing so at some point if you are looking to actually improve and hit more targets and dial in those numbers. So the first thing then is it breaks the total data down into the GHG protocol categories. So we've got scope 1 and scope 2 here. So this is an interesting one that I'll touch on very briefly, is that we're able to, there's two ways that you can get to that initial estimate of scope 1 and 2. We have that emissions calculator, but we also, thanks to some mathematical magic from Ardor, what we do here is if you've just uploaded your supply chain data, we can actually get to a broad stroke scope 1 and 2 estimate, not compliance ready, but an initial overview just using your supply chain data. Anna, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I just want to clarify, this is not my magic. So the methodologies that sit behind here are methodologies that are acknowledged and accepted for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. My name is that what sits behind this entire assessment. So what we can do is just from ingesting the spend data that Ben will go through in a second for each of your suppliers, we are able to do a lot of screening, a lot of supply chain screening based on the internal data sets and supply chain networks that we maintain internally here. And the reason why we're able to do that is because I essentially found myself at the forefront of the research in this area for 15 years in my career at uni. So I do this internally at Fair Supply, but it's not like I came up with these methodologies. This is something that I've worked in for a long time. So we are able to utilize this here. But yeah.
Arnold's obviously very humble, but I think it is a good point that this is if you're thinking about this from a reporting and a compliance level, like these aren't kind of non-standard ways of calculating the data. It's just he and like others, let me put it that way, have done the work over the last couple of decades to piece together the data that's needed so that, with just the information about the supplier and the expenditure, we can, for each of those suppliers in the supplier group, do those calculations. And I think just to put it in more like real terms here, you have a set of, these are dummy suppliers, so they are fake names to protect the innocent, but these are the data that we've put into these example accounts for you is actually very reflective of a standard supply chain, in this case in the construction field. So this is a very realistic example. And so what you can see here is the key things to look at if you ignore the fake company names are the step before this, just to be really clear as well, because there was a question about the data collection and ingestion, is the step before this is really just uploading a CSV of this supplier data, more or less a financial list, exported from whatever accounting or procurement system that you use. We just really need that name and the spend amount, and we do the rest. But if you're thinking about this structurally, what it does is it uses standardized taxonomy and way of thinking about how we classify those companies to a sector, and a sector being a country and more or less a product and service, or in some cases we call it an industry combination. So for the suppliers of this fake construction working company, you've got a supplier here who produces cement, lime, and plaster, and they're based in China. And you can see here the spend amount. And from that, we basically then calculate the based off the mapping of both those carbon factors and the supply chain. We can see here we've got 2.4 kilotons of CO2e down to the fourth decimal point. And we've got per $1 million spent. So this gives you I guess a normalized number that's easier to track, because it is not so dependent on the amount that you're spending on that supplier. You've got the kilotons in total based off the spend. So in this case, the spend is less than $1 million. So you can see that the actual amount is less. And then you can see across your suppliers what percentage of they make up of that profile. And these are those industry ratings that I showed earlier, where you had those two companies in high. And so from that data, that gives you, you're able to deep dive on an individual supplier. But if we're thinking about this from a reporting and compliance perspective, and again, trying to kind of stepping back a little bit from Fair Supply, what this gives you and what you can be looking for there is a view of that particular supplier and the exposure to carbon emissions that you have from them and their supply chain, and a way essentially of identifying those suppliers who are impacting your emissions more than others. And some of that might be sector-based, it might be related to the amount that you're spending on them, but there's lots of different factors there that you need to be starting to think about. And then you also need to look at and think about down the supply chain and the dependencies here. So this is maybe a better view here, but you can see here the tiers. So this is where you can understand more about going down from tier 1 to tier N, or 10 in this case. There's the larger concentration for this company is at tier 2, but then you've got still quite a bit at tier 3, and then it goes down a lot since there. And so that helps you understand exactly where in the supply chain your exposure to carbon emissions are. And I guess to the point earlier from Orly around, does the supplier have to use fair supply tool? Like, this gives you that very good understanding and the quantitative analysis of the emissions in the supply chain for scope 3, but it also gives you the opportunity in terms of your governance and activities of what you do next, of identifying those suppliers or those sectors in your supply chain that you need to actually go and look at a bit more deeply. And that's where we'll talk about the due diligence and the deeper dive stuff in a second. Arno, did you have anything further to add to that before we jump, or we could jump over to the breakdowns for GHG Protocol and scope 1, 2, and 3?
Well, yeah, I mean, I can talk about this for days, literally. So, I think we should probably cover a little bit sort of what sits in the background, how we're able to actually do this, but not too much, because we've got other exciting things we want to talk about. So, can you go down to the tier plot, Ben? So, that's a good view. So, maybe you can go back to the companies quickly. Company view, yeah. So, well, as Ben said, like, what we need to do this assessment is actually quite limited. We just need the company name, we need the spend amount, and everything else happens on fair supply's side. And if you were going with more conventional approaches, they often involve emissions factors, and emissions factors are essentially just a translation of the spend amount into emissions that are associated in a scope 3 perspective for this specific purchase. Now, emissions factors definitely have their place, but what Ben covered on top of this is that there's actually not much visibility where the scope 3 emissions sit. Scope 3 emissions sit in sometimes tens of millions of supply chains, and an emissions factor boils all the impacts down to just one data point. And we maintain our own supply chain database that we could use to generate emissions factors. We don't, but we could use it. And so we have so many more layers of visibility and can really pinpoint towards there's a high scope 3 exposure for this specific supplier, but the supplier is actually not causing this exposure themselves. It's embedded in their own supply chains. So those are all insights that we can deliver here that are very, very data heavy. And with Ben's brilliant team, we are able to simplify the touch point for our customers to these complex data sets quite significantly. And it's a very smooth operation, essentially.
And so I guess if you think about the reporting requirements and the things that are coming, I think what's like most important, and like in terms of like what the bar is for scope 3, this really gives you that ability to screen your entire supply chain with a very, very small amount of data. I think there is still like a really important step next, which is what do you do with that information other than just put it together into a report from a compliance perspective. But before we jump to that, I think the key thing to understand is like what this really gives you the ability to do is then actually interrogate and understand the data. So you can understand where in the world your most problematic areas are, and this might kind of uncover things that you didn't even know about your supply chain, particularly the things that are hidden under tier 2 and tier 3. You can also look at it by industry and look at where are those areas where perhaps if you put some more effort into, say, the suppliers that are in the electricity by coal and coking coal, etc., you would get an outsized return in terms of improvement of exposure to emissions, for example. You can also look at it by sector, by tier, as we said, and you can see here, there's where you can see something interesting, which is like if you just looked at your tier 1, it doesn't look too bad, but actually a lot of the exposure to emissions starts at tier 2. And that's what a lot of companies in Australia find, just because of Australia by nature, having a lot of good regulations and better operators. You do find that at tier 2 and tier 3, for example, that's where it really starts to the rubber starts to hit the road. So it's good to have that visibility so you can understand where you take that action. I won't talk through this chart very much right now because it's a lot to take in, but I will jump across just quickly to round it out, just to talk again about the actual reporting. So this gives you an example of, you have all of that data that gives you lots of insights. It gives you, these are the things that, again, if you step back from Fair Supply for a second, you need to be thinking about your suppliers, their supply chains, what your exposure is to emissions through those supply chains. How do you, I guess, pull that into an estimate or from a screening perspective? And there's, that we've just shown you one way that you can do that relatively easily using that methodology. But then also it needs to be broken down into a format that is acceptable from a standards perspective. And so as I showed you on the previous screen, we've broken the data down into the GHG protocol categories. And we also look at upstream and downstream. But fundamentally, again, this comes down to a couple of key numbers. It comes down to what are the total scope 3 emissions in your supply chain? What are the upstream and downstream category emissions? And that's where I'll go into a little bit more depth in a sec. Getting that summary and what proportion of your total emissions it stands for, because that helps you build out a plan and understand it from a governance perspective. But then we break it down into some of these more these are more actionable and more easier to understand GHG protocol categories like goods and services. And so what this gives you the benefit of doing is then thinking about these emissions by, I guess, stream or category as aligned with the GHG protocol, which means that you can report on it, but also means that you can, the benefit of these categories is that you can think about it more clearly in terms of how your business operates and where that exposure to the emissions are either upstream or downstream, as the case may be. So I'll pause there for a second. I think just to round it out, the same thing applies in terms of being really clear and transparent about the methodologies that are used, as well as making sure that regardless of whether you do this in an Excel spreadsheet, in Fair Supply or otherwise, that you have like a solid record of how you have done the calculations, what data was used, and like the keeping track of that over time is really, really important, and keeping it consistent, because you need that audit trail and audit log. And I think, as Anna pointed out, the biggest pain point that I hear from customers is often not actually about like what are emissions factors or how do I do these calculations, but it's more the more practical things about like, oh, we've had someone pulling together this data internally, but then they left, and then I don't know where this spreadsheet is, and it's like really hard to keep a track of this stuff. And so there's some very practical challenges, I think, associated with this that mean, I think, once a company is needing to report on this, and potentially report across multiple regulations, modern slavery and, maybe NGR and the Australian government regulations, then the actual tracking and maintaining that data legitimacy is a really key part of the process.